past year, something really strange happened that has stuck with me ever since. A coworker suggested I post it here, under an anonymous name of course, and I wasn't familiar with Reddit, so I did a little research and found this sub. I think you'll guys enjoy it. It has all the creepy elements readers seem to like, and best of all, unlike most of what I've read here, this one is actually true. After high school, I had no clue what I wanted to do, and with no better options, I decided to join the Navy. Eventually, I became a corpsman, attached to a unit of Marines in Afghanistan. After my time was up, I went to school to get my EMT certs and then my paramedics one a few years later. While attending college, I met an amazing girl and we began dating. We would go on to move in with each other not long after, and from all appearances, I would soon become a devoted father and husband, just as my dad had before me. It wasn't to be, however. Time flew by and soon 3 years had passed. None of what I had hoped to happen ever materialized. Things slowly degraded to the point where the relationship ended and I was a broken-hearted loser, unlike my father before me. While doing my job, I was able to focus on my work for the most part. My free time was the hardest. I needed to find a distraction. After a bit of consideration, I came upon a volunteer search and rescue organization in my area. I contacted them and they were happy to have me. I jumped head on into the job, and in many ways, it's like the military. You go out into the wilderness and help people in trouble. I like it so much, I'm hoping to make it a full-time job when I get the opportunity. I haven't thought of my ex in months. And that's enough about me. Let's get to why I'm here. It's not out of the ordinary for citizens to report coming in contact with people displaying strange or odd behavior. This can range from a terrified Karen meeting an armed hiker, a more common thing as we get more and more refugees from states like California. It can also be something more concerning like this case was. I was loafing around the house when I got a call from my boss. A sheriff's deputy had received a call from a woman who had been walking with her dog on some public land. She ran into a gentleman on the trail. At first, he came across as a normal young man, but as the conversation went on, he became more detached from reality. He claimed he was being pursued by a group of men. They had been chasing him for over 100 miles. He appeared genuinely afraid. According to the lady, he was wearing a backpack and clean, expensive outdoor clothing. She didn't get the idea that he was homeless or intoxicated. The lady felt bad for the guy. He didn't seem dangerous. She was attempting to get him to come with her to the sheriff's office, but he disappeared when she turned her back, and she went directly to the sheriff anyway. The deputy knew we were better trained for this stuff and hoped that we could track him down before something happened. The actual search didn't get going until the following morning. We found his trail quickly. He did seem to be in a bit of distress from his tracks, and it didn't take long for us to catch up to him. It was not the happy ending I'd hoped for. He appeared to have ended his life at some point during the night. The trail he had been on ended at a sheer drop of 1,000 feet. A few of us retrieved his body and the search had effectively ended. I had returned to the top to pick up a few of the victim's personal effects he'd dropped. Our head tracker was kneeling down a few yards away from me. He was staring at something very intently and mumbling to himself. He saw me and called me over. He pointed at the ground and asked me to tell him what I saw. Nothing grabbed my attention at first, but the longer I looked, something jumped out at me. The dry dirt had a spread out look, kind of like it had been swept with a broom, or a tree limb. Then I noticed the edge of a boot print. All but the heel had been swept away. The tracker, who I'll call Jack, stood up and walked over to a small tree with a broken stump where a limb had been. He pointed at it, and I nodded in recognition. I began searching for the freshly broken limb and quickly found it. It had been carelessly tossed away in some bushes. Jack told me to follow him to the cliff edge. We stood at the precipice and turned back toward the approaching trail. Now, in the bright light of day, you could see it. All the way up to the edge were visible sweep marks. The only remaining tracks belonged to the team. I hope I've been able to convey my meaning. If not, I'll be a bit less dramatic. In short, someone had made a sloppy effort to hide their presence. In doing so, they made a big mistake. Have you caught it yet? Well, I'll help a little. Why, if a man had come up a trail where his tracks had been visible for miles, would they suddenly disappear 30 or so yards from the edge of a cliff, the very same cliff he supposedly jumped from. There was no other path to reach the edge. We even checked to be sure in every possible direction. We had loads of questions but no answers. I looked over at Jack and asked what this all meant, and his answer was less than satisfactory. I'm not really sure, but I got a hard time believing that boy flew all the way from there, down there. We decided that we'd keep it to ourselves for the time being. We didn't want to cause any undue stress on his loved ones by coming to them with some harebrained conspiracy theory. Even now, I can't come to a solid conclusion about that kid's fate. Had I not noticed the partial heel print and missing tracks, I probably wouldn't have blinked an eye. While I do have my theories, I'll keep them to myself. You probably would think I was crazy anyway. No, I'll let the lot of y'all discuss some ideas among yourselves, and I look forward to seeing what y'all come up with. But I warn you though, any discussions of aliens or anything paranormal will be laughed at and mocked. They say the most logical answer is usually the most likely. So, what sounds the most logical to you? There was no way to know how long I'd been running. At least 10 minutes, no more than 20. Either way, it would be faster and further than I've ever ran. When you're running for your life, you can push your body far beyond what you could ever imagine. I shouldn't have stopped, but the burning was too excruciating, and he could be right behind me. He may not have made it more than 100 yards, and I wasn't ready to find out. I saw him, that gun. The clip had to hold 40 to 50 bullets, I imagine, and that had to be enough to turn you to dust. No one would ever be able to identify me, and maybe that's what he was counting on. I had no choice but to carry on. I could die any minute, and if I could just find a road or park employee, I might survive. Daring to stop just long enough to regain my breath, I continued until dark. Only now I felt safe enough to stop. The night was warm. Starting a fire would have been foolhardy anyway, but with nothing to wrap in but the fleece in my pack, I zipped it all the way and pulled the hood tightly over my head. A rotting log laid near me. It had a large hollow place on the backside which I curled up into sleep. And sleep came quickly. I awoke once or twice but swiftly drifted off again. Awakening at dawn, I renewed my search. It had become more of a search now. Unless my pursuer made himself known, I must assume that he just gave up. The chill in my body soon faded with my exertions, and for the present, water, thankfully, was plentiful. Hunger was my true enemy. I'd never gone more than one night without eating. It had been over 24 hours. Starvation was not a death I wished to experience, and slowly wasting away lacked the romance often given to it. Maybe the gun would have been a better choice, I thought to myself, and neither would be my fate that day. As the sun drew high above me, I stumbled upon a road, the same road I entered in 3 days before, and my suffering ended soon after. A group of men out doing fire prevention work came upon me, and it was they who brought me to the main ranger station. I recounted my harrowing experience to them, and this was when their search began. To properly express how I found myself there, I must begin 3 days prior. Most of my adult life, I lived near to a very well-known national park in the United States. It never attracted me until I had a very difficult breakup. I believed the isolation would provide me the peace that I needed, and late on a Friday afternoon, I arrived at the park. Everything was set up before dusk. I spent the rest of the evening relaxing with a beer beside the fire. I used this time to plan my movements for the next day. The quiet was relaxing, and sleep came easily, something I had been battling for many weeks. I didn't stir again until 8 a.m. I enjoyed a small breakfast of oatmeal and packed a small bag for the day's hike. I was heading to a point 5 miles ahead. It was set above a pasture where many wild animals were said to graze. Here, I would have a quick lunch and enjoy the sights, and I hoped to make it back to my camp before dusk. The first leg of the hike went well. At some point, I took a wrong turn and got lost. I was unaware of this for some time. When I did this, I panicked. I only managed to become more lost. Hours passed. I seemed to get deeper and deeper into the woods. About 3 p.m., I heard voices in the distance. I began running toward them. I tripped and fell on a hose of some type. I didn't appear to be hurt, and I stood up and dusted myself off. As I did, a man walked up behind me. He spoke English with a very heavy accent. I explained my situation and asked for help, and another man walked up. This man was carrying an assault rifle, and I became very nervous when I saw this. He looked very nervous also. The two men began talking. They appeared to be arguing about something, and neither man ever took their eyes off of me. As this happened, a third man arrived. He was unarmed and seemed to be in charge. He spoke to both men in a gruff and confident manner. As he finished, he pointed at me, and the man with the rifle said, "Okay," and frowned. All three stepped back a few steps. The armed man pointed the rifle at me and pulled something backwards. The handle slammed back with great force, and despite my ignorance of firearms, I had a good idea what was coming. A sick feeling welled up in my stomach. My heart began pounding. I had to run, but I didn't know where. As he raised the gun to his shoulder, I took my chance. Fleeing blindly, branches and vines tore at my face and arms. Any moment, I expected a bullet to rip through my body. A few zips and cracks struck nearby. In seconds, my legs ached from the exertion. My lungs burned, fighting for any small amount of air. I wasn't sure how much I had left in me, and I was sure stopping meant death. Going back meant death. My only options were death. You're aware of the rest. The Rangers contacted a few outside agencies to help with the search. It was 2 weeks before a member of the FBI contacted me. He had a few questions, I answered them and asked him for any news, and he was purposely vague, but I gathered that the men had evaded capture. He assured me that there was no present danger to the public as long as they stuck to the marked trails. I'll not be returning there regardless, and that's the extent of what I know. I do have some theories, illegal marijuana farming among them, but I can't be certain at present. I did fear my assailants would hunt me down to my home, but it proved an unfounded concern. PTSD is common to people who have such encounters, and I expected to be among them, yet it has been 17 years and I remain the same person for the most part, thankfully, and I feel fine. The ordeal was a learning experience nonetheless. In light of the attack, the problems I was having at that time seem petty in hindsight. In that capacity, I guess my escape to the woods served its purpose. My role in this story begins at 10. It was my first deer hunt with my dad and uncle. When my uncle pointed out a set of tracks, I became enthralled. My uncle noticed my fascination and fostered it. He was an accomplished tracker and shared his knowledge with me. I supplemented his teachings with books. Nature became my home, and wildlife became my family. My desire to hunt dwindled, and I used my meager skills to guide those who had not. I don't disapprove of the practice, it's part of being an animal, and make no mistake, we are part of that family. After my time in school was complete, I took to the road in search of the unknown, things not written in books or thoughts lost. My work as a guide kept me fed, but it was my search that nourished me. I grew restless with my work and sought out a new challenge. A position with a search and rescue group became available. I applied for it and was immediately hired. We were close to a national park, one state park, and countless acres of public land. Despite being a moderately experienced tracker by this point, I didn't start out doing it exclusively. Tracking people, although very similar to tracking animals, has its own set of challenges, and I had yet to master them. You really never do. My job was to stick to our team leader and listen to everything he said. He's a patient and reassuring teacher. I've learned a lot from him. I would take part in countless operations before I would get my chance to lead a team, and it would not be with my group, however. A sister organization in the neighboring state was in great need immediately, and I was to lead a team to find a lost hiker. He had been missing for almost a week, and conditions were forecasted to get very bad. I arrived the next day and went straight to work. The situation was well beyond ideal. The target had a 4-day lead on me, and the area had already been churned up by countless numbers of people. Most of the morning was spent looking for fresh tracks. I came across some just before lunch and began the search. Everything about the trail matched the description I'd been given. Boot size, weight. As we grew closer to the objective, something began to change. Small discrepancies began to arise. I dismissed them as fatigue and continued. And near dark, I crested a hill and caught sight of a small tent. I called out over radio that our lost hiker had been found. A feeling of satisfaction washed over me, and it was short-lived, unfortunately. We called out to the tent, and a small, well-groomed young man appeared. I was surprised at how fresh he looked. My team greeted and assured him he was safe. A confused look came on his face. "What do you guys mean? I just arrived here this morning. Did someone report me missing or something?" Suddenly I knew why nothing had made sense. I asked the guy his name, and it didn't match what I had on my paperwork. Just to be safe, and I looked around at his things. Although similar in many ways, many differences also existed. Differences someone of my experience should have noticed. Shame extinguished the satisfaction. I couldn't look at my team. I reluctantly called in to explain my mistake. I could tell from the group's leader's tone that he was unhappy. He said to me, "So, son, what you're telling me is that the lost man is still out there? For another night?" After he said that, I felt fear and disgust. Because of a simple mistake, this poor man was doomed to another night alone in the woods, and a snowstorm was expected the following afternoon, and the man's odds of surviving another night was nearing 0. I was unable to face the rest of the team after that. I wanted to leave right then, but a man's life depended on me. I sent my team back for the night and camped alone near the camper. As soon as the sun broke, I was back on the trail. My mistake was now crystal clear, and in my ridiculous hubris, I'd ignored where one man's tracks had diverged from another's on the same trail. The lost hiker had been through the same trail just the day before, but gone off in another direction. I should have listened to my instincts. I had been too eager and sure of myself. It wasn't the time to beat myself up, though. As I grew closer, I could tell the hiker was in distress. The skips and drags said as much, and it was late morning when I finally reached the end of the trail, and it was far worse than I feared. The man was now down on all fours, crawling like a child. Up ahead, I noticed a mound of bright clothing, and this had to be him. I rushed up to check his vitals. The coldness of his skin made me retract. I hurriedly called over the radio, and the team were with me in minutes. We all knew that he was gone, but the paramedics tried anyway. I could do nothing but sit with my hands over my face. It had been my first time leading a team, and because of my arrogance, a man was dead. I seriously considered quitting right there and never returning home. No one would ever trust me again. Although I did return home, I was serious about quitting. I'd let a lot of people down, people who had trusted me. My mentor had to have been ashamed of me. I wanted so badly to call and apologize, but I assumed that he'd hang up on me. Why would he want to be reminded of such a big failure? And that's why I was so shocked when he called me. He wanted to know why I had not been in contact with anyone, and this confused me. Haven't you heard? I screwed up so badly a man died because of it. You could tell Mark, our boss, I'm not coming back. I'm a liability to the organization, him, and everyone. His answer shocked me even more. He simply sighed and said, "No, I'll not do that. So what if you screwed up? God knows I've screwed up a lot. I screwed up yesterday. We fall all the time. You failed searches yourself before. I don't understand. Why throw away your talents over one mistake? You know, a lot of people depend on us. You're willing to risk all of them dying because you made one rookie mistake. Why don't you get your crap together and check in? If you want to quit, you can tell Mark to his face. I really thought better of you, son." And I was struck dumb. I felt foolish now. No one had called me out or chided me for my mistake, yet I flogged myself constantly. Was it possible I was just a self-absorbed drama queen? I managed to eke out an okay and hung up. I felt like a child who had just been dressed down by his father. I did just as he said, though. When I arrived at the station, everybody was there. It appeared there was a training session that day. Mark noticed me and asked if I was joining them. I didn't sense any anger or distrust. Although reluctant, I just said yes and took an empty seat at one of the tables. The class went on as usual. Every day has been a wonderful experience since. Not once have I felt unwanted. Mark nor any of the other team have ever spoken about it. My mentor and I have never discussed that phone call. I guess there is really no need to. I feel terrible about not finding that man, but I know for a fact that we'd never be able to bury him in peace if we didn't at least try. Just recently, I discovered my father has early-stage dementia. I was on a week-long vacation with my family when I got a call. A police officer informed me that my father's car was found abandoned on a back road far out on the edge of the county. I lost my mind, as you would expect. We cut the trip short and hurried back home. I had to wait until I met with the police to get the whole story. A deputy sheriff was on a regular patrol when he came upon a car haphazardly pulled over to the side of the road. The driver's side door was wide open. When he approached, he realized the engine was still running. There was no sign of the car's occupants. Per routine, the deputy called in the plate, and it came back to my father. This set a missing persons case into motion. When I arrived, my father was still missing and there had been no reports of seeing him. Although concerned for his safety, I had no reason to be afraid. There was no indication at the scene that he'd been injured. The prevailing theory was that he had entered the surrounding woods for whatever reason and became lost. He's a very competent woodsman and hunter. Therefore, I had no end of faith that he would pop up whenever he was ready. During the time we weren't able to take part in the search, my husband and I spammed social media with photos and descriptions of him. 3 days passed before there was a sighting. A woman had been outside her house hanging clothes on the line when she noticed a slightly disheveled older man walking through the nearby woods. She said that he appeared disoriented. She immediately ran inside to call the sheriff, but when she came back out, he was gone. The tip proved to be enough to find him. A small group of volunteers came upon him hitchhiking on another road 5 miles away from where he disappeared. We raced over to the location as soon as we heard, and this was my first indication something was wrong. Just as the lady had said, Dad was visibly disoriented and confused. He was very dehydrated and exhausted. I assume this was the reason. He was taken to the hospital where I spent that night alongside him. The following morning, his condition was greatly improved, but something was still off. I expressed my concerns to the doctor and he ordered some cognitive tests. Dad was released that afternoon and we decided to have him stay with us for a while, at least until the tests could be done and we could assess his condition. The tests were done later that week and they were much worse than I'd feared. The neurologist said that there were several signs of cognitive decline. Dad had difficulty answering questions a normal person of his age can usually easily answer. During the time he stayed with us, I was able to witness these problems firsthand. It seems his memory gets worse as the day wears on. A small amount can be attributed to fatigue, but there is a marked difference in the way he was just 6 months ago. It's a very sad thing to see in one who was once so sharp. The past month or so has been an especially disheartening time in all of our lives. At present, Dad is back at home. He had no longer had access to his car, and I'm not sure he misses it. My husband and I are currently torn between placing him in a facility where he can get the help he needs as he declines or moving him in with us. I'm not qualified to nurse him nor strong enough to help him with his daily things such as hygiene. All this seems inconsequential when weighed against a fate where you are surrounded by strangers as you slowly slide into oblivion. In times like this, I'm reminded of how lucky I am to have such a supportive family. Nothing has been set in stone as I write this, but the time to decide is quickly approaching. Any suggestions from the comments will be appreciated, and please include us in your prayers. Thank you all for listening. A few months ago, I had a very unnerving incident involving my young son. It was the way it ended that has me so upset. Please forgive me for being long-winded. I want to be sure I present a clear and complete picture of that day. For context, my husband and I are in our mid-20s, and we have 2 children. They are Lee, who is a boy, 4, and Lynn, who is a 6-year-old girl. The differences between the two have been an amazing thing to witness. Lynn is becoming more independent, whereas Lee is still very attached to his mommy. Most of his life was spent in lockdown, and this has created its own set of problems. We are trying to fix those presently, and he began learning to walk about the time the lockdowns began. He wanted to go outside and explore. It was sad to see him so eager to do something that he was essentially forbidden to do. It wasn't a situation you could explain to someone so young either, and that's why I was so relieved when things opened back up. My husband and I had a lot to catch up on. It was a year before we could take off any time for the family. In early June, we set aside a weekend. Lee would finally get to explore the world to his heart's content. We loaded up into our SUV and drove out to a local nature area. It covers 50 square miles of woods and nature trails. It was a beautiful day with clear skies. Lee was obviously very excited. I hoped a few hours running through the woods would give him a decent amount of the exercise he needed. The kids and I followed behind as my husband led us down the marked trails. Somewhere along the journey, Lynn fell and hurt her knee. It wasn't a big deal and she dealt with it well. I was proud to see my little girl growing up right before my eyes. While I was cleaning her cut, Lee wandered off into the woods without us noticing. It took a couple of minutes for us to realize. I did not handle this well. Visions of grizzly bears eating him alive rushed through my head, even though we don't have any type of bears around here. My husband remained the solid thinking man he always is and suggested we began looking. After all, Lee was only 4. He wasn't capable of getting very far. I took Lynn with me and went back down the trail while my husband, who has much more woods knowledge, searched the forest on both sides. The longer the search went, the more panicked I grew. I was scaring Lynn so much that she began crying. This knocked me back down to earth a little. I took a big breath and assured her everything would be okay. This was as much to calm myself as her. As I spoke, a lady up the trail yelled out to me. I looked up and saw her standing with Lee and holding his hand. I was relieved beyond belief. I ran up to him, bawling my eyes out. He had a smile a mile wide. I didn't want to make him scared. He didn't seem to be aware of how serious things had been. I wiped my eyes and reached out for him. He jogged over to me with his little legs, and I held him tight, probably too tight. I thanked the lady and asked where she had found him. She said that she had been walking up the trail and noticed him walking alone out of the woods. He saw her and walked right up to her. All she had to do was put out her hand and he took it. She said he seemed very comfortable doing so. I was too relieved then to think straight, and it was only once we were back at home when her words began to bother me. And that brings us to my problem, friends. In the time since then, I have been consumed by what she told me. Please don't misunderstand me here. I'm unendingly thankful for her assistance. I would pay every cent I have to get one of my babies back. It's the apparent ease at which she was able to get Lee to go with her. I'm sure you all can see how an evil person could use this to their advantage. No telling how many times this has happened. I've tried to let it go, but the fears always seem to work their way back into my mind eventually. I wish I could sit Lee down and explain the dangers to him. He's at that age where I'm not sure he would understand the nuances of my words. I don't want to scare him or make him terrified of other people. I'm afraid if I'm too straightforward, it could make him anxious and ruin his ability to make friends. Growing up is already so hard for these kids these days. I don't want to make it worse. So here I am. My brain is twisted into a million different directions, and I'm open to any reasonable suggestions, and the ball is in your court, I suppose. What do you guys suggest I do about this? Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Many of us did it or will do it at some point. You're riding in a car with your boyfriend and he does or says something stupid. Maybe he calls you by his ex's name. You fly off the handle and demand to be let out of the car that very second. He tries to initiate damage control, but you aren't having it. He gives in and stops the car. You get out and start walking down the road. Do you have a destination? Did you consider that it may be freezing outside? No, you did not. Now you're stuck on a strange road, freezing your butt off, and your pride won't allow you to back down. In most instances, cooler minds prevail, and the indiscretion is forgotten. There are the few that do not, however. It's important to examine these occasions because they are when tragedy usually occurs, and I'm here to share my own example of when such a situation goes bad, and I hope it will drive home the importance of thinking before you act. This took place when I was 20. The guy I was dating at the time attended the same college as I did. He was a year older with his own apartment, and the two of us were coming back from a movie when he committed the unforgivable sin of laughing at my makeup. I was despondent. Just as in the scenario earlier, I blew my top and demanded he pull over. I had to be anywhere but in that car with him. He attempted to defuse the situation, but this just dug the hole deeper. I was screaming now. For a second time, I ordered him to let me out of the car. I seriously tried to jump out while the car was still in motion. When he saw this, he finally pulled over. Saying an expletive, the car came to a stop and I got out, leaving my sweater and jacket behind. After a few steps, I heard the sound of a car slowly approaching from behind me. I ignored it and kept walking. He started calling out to me and begging me to get back in the car. The longer he went on, the more desperate he sounded, and he must have had enough. He ran up and tried to grab me, and my fight-or-flight mode kicked in and I ran into the nearby woods. I had expected him to chase after me, but he didn't. The last thing I remember him saying is something like, "F this, if you think I'm spending the rest of the night waiting for you to come out, you're sorely mistaken," which makes a lot of sense looking back. I heard the squealing of tires off in the distance and then complete silence. Now, I was alone in the woods at night. I had no flashlight or knowledge of where I was. I'd fled so deep into the forest I'd lost my bearings. I searched around, but the road was nowhere to be seen. No sounds of cars could be heard. And this was about the time I started to notice how cold it really was. Suddenly, his little joke sounded a lot less serious. And here I was. It's well after midnight. I'm stranded in the middle of a forest I know nothing about, and the temperature was dropping quick. My dire position was beginning to sink in. It took a run-in with a pack of coyotes for me to move into a full-on panic. My only friend was the moon, and it just so happened to be full or nearly full on this night. I've been stumbling my way through the woods for at least an hour. Suddenly, far off ahead of me, the howl of coyotes began, and now I was genuinely freaked out. At the time, I thought they were wolves. I knew nothing about coyotes. I can laugh now, but I promise I wasn't at the time. Imagine being alone in the dark with a pack of man-eaters. I turned around and ran in the opposite direction. All the while, I was convinced that I could hear them chasing me. Had they actually been chasing me, this would have been the worst thing to do. I can't begin to count the number of times a tree branch ripped or poked me in the face and arms. I was ultimately forced to stop out of mere exhaustion. The howls were far in the distance now, and I was too tired to go on. If I was going to die, I prayed it was quick. In hindsight, the coyotes likely didn't know I was there or didn't even care. Knowledge that did me no good in the moment, unfortunately. My escape had warmed me for a while, but I soon began to shiver uncontrollably. Without any way to start a fire, I assumed I'd be best off if I kept walking. I went on for as long as I could, but my body began to give out. I was aware I may die if I stopped, yet I couldn't be bothered to care. I was minutes from giving up when I found myself on a gravel road. It was like a second wind rushed through me. I knew it had to lead to the main road, and based on intuition, I picked a direction and followed it. At moments, I noticed I was almost jogging. I had to slow myself down, maybe half an hour into my walk. I heard what sounded like cars in the distance, and I broke out into a full run. As I rounded the bend in the road, the highway came into view, and not much happened after this. I followed it south until I came to a 24-hour gas station, and there I called a friend to pick me up. We stopped at IHOP on the way home, and this is where I watched the first sunrise of my life, and it was a truly beautiful sight indeed. After a good long sleep, I called my boyfriend and just ended things. Judging by his reaction, he was relieved. Our relationship had been constant turmoil and drama for most of its existence. I was back on the market now, but I didn't go find a new guy just yet. I took this time to focus on myself and what I wanted from and expected in a relationship. Although that brief time in the woods didn't amount to much in the end, it showed me how much I needed to mature. When I did begin dating again, I tried to change the type of guys I went out with. If one or both partners behave childishly, there will be no end to the drama. It seems this was the right way to go. Less than a year after this happened, I met my husband by chance in a bookstore. He is the definition of chill. His energy is rubbed off on all of us, especially me. And that's it for me. I hope I got my point across clearly and it's able to help at least someone. Finding yourself alone in a strange place can be a traumatic event for a child. Now imagine it's a massive forest and you have no idea where you are. This happened to me when I was 8. Our family was on vacation in the Ozarks. I think it was Missouri, so there's a good chance it was at one of their state parks. I clearly remember how amazed I was at all the trees. Being from Arizona, it wasn't something you saw a lot of. Now that I'm older, I realize there are forests here, but trees weren't common from where I was from. I was only 8 and my life experiences were very limited. The mood of the trip was already dark even before I got lost. Although I wasn't aware of the divorce waiting just a year ahead, I could feel that something was just wrong. An air of tension permeated the entire holiday. My brother, just 2 years my senior, was uncharacteristically quiet and well-behaved. Any attempt I made to provoke a fight was ignored. It all made for a long and boring trip. This meant I went crazy when we reached Branson. Our second day there, we visited a place called Silver Dollar City. It's a theme park, very similar to some places like Six Flags. I ran my parents ragged. I wanted to ride every ride, even ones I was too small to ride. I threw a fit every time I was told no, and all in all, I was a giant brat. The following day, we drove out to the park. My parents planned on camping a few days before heading for home. Camping was a new concept for me. I couldn't understand why anyone would do it. I spent most of the first day asking question after question. I demanded to know everything there was to know, and I had to know it immediately. It had to be exhausting for my parents. I spent a lot of time later on wondering if I was responsible for the failure of their marriage. Could I be the reason my dad left? At the time, though, I only cared about myself and what I wanted. My great upheaval happened the next day. Sleeping in a tent was the coolest thing in the world. I'd made a drastic change from the day before. Now, I wanted to live this way for the rest of my life. My dad had to practically drag me away from the fire at the end of the night, and this would prove to be an ominous sign of a future fascination. That problem would be a few years down the road. At the present time, I was eager to explore the woods around me. After breakfast, the whole family headed out for a hike around the lake. Every few feet, I would have to stop and examine something. I wasn't concerned about keeping up or anything else. My dad did a really good job wrangling me, but if you have kids, you know how good they are at disappearing. And that's what happened with me. One of the times I stopped to look, I wandered off the path. I have no idea how long I was walking, but at some point, my stomach growled. I paused to ask my mother for a snack and realized that I was completely alone. I looked around for anything familiar. Every tree and fern looked identical, and I figured I couldn't be that far away. I called out for my mom, then my dad. No one answered. That was when a sick feeling slowly began creeping into my stomach. I wasn't very scared at first. I was sure Mom and Dad would find me soon. And for God knows how long, I walked around looking for something I recognized. As the hours went by, the sun got lower in the sky and the sick feeling got stronger until I was in a full-blown panic. I was running around from tree to tree, screaming for help, and just before dark, I stumbled upon a trail. Off in the distance, I saw the silhouette of a grown-up. When I screamed at them, they turned around and rushed toward me. They were moving so fast I wondered if they were some kind of monster coming to get me. I was seriously thinking about running off when I hear my dad's voice call back to me. I was so relieved I fell down right there and cried my eyes out. The feeling of him scooping me up and carrying me away was the best feeling I'd ever felt. At least until my daughter was born, that is. We got back to camp and my mom hugged me until I couldn't breathe. A bunch of people in uniforms were standing around and talking. A paramedic even examined me. I was so exhausted I fell asleep in my parents' tent and didn't move until it was time to pack up the next morning. After my little adventure, my parents decided they spent enough time relaxing. We loaded everything into the car and hit the road. 2 days later, we were back in Phoenix and all was right in the world again. I quickly forgot about everything that happened. Like I said, my parents would get divorced the next year, and that would be the end of family vacations. I would go camping with one or two of my friends over the next few years, and by then I was old enough to know better. I'm 27 now, yet I still think about it on occasion. Regardless of age, every time I find myself alone in a strange place, I'm reminded of what happened in that forest. I guess some things, no matter how small they may seem, stick with us forever. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if you see a fart, suck it.